Ryan Hall had always been the kind of man who believed that order was a form of peace. After 15 years of working as an architect in the chaos of city projects, he had finally bought a property far from noise, a quiet corner lot on the edge of a suburban development bordered by tall oaks and a narrow stream. The house wasn't perfect, but it was a dream he could shape with his own hands. The old structure needed reinforcement, the yard required clearing, and the driveway was cracked, but Ryan saw it all as a blank canvas. He hired a trusted contractor, Michael Torres, a straightforward, good-humored man who had built half the houses in that county. They started early every morning, their tools humming like a heartbeat through the neighborhood, rebuilding the front porch and preparing the ground for new concrete work. For Ryan, those first days felt like a new beginning, a return to something simple and grounded after years of deadlines and gray offices. What he didn't know was that peace in this neighborhood came with a price, and a man who believed he owned everyone who lived under his invisible jurisdiction. Garrett Morgan had been the HOA president for over a decade, a retired police officer with a loud voice, a beer gut, and an unwavering conviction that his word was law. He drove an oversized truck decorated with a faded blue line decal and spent most afternoons patrolling the streets like a sheriff in exile. The residents tolerated him because it was easier than arguing. Some feared him, others ignored him, but everyone knew that Garrett could make their lives miserable if he wanted to. He fined people for leaving trash cans visible, for Christmas lights taken down too late, for fences an inch too high. When Ryan moved in, Garrett had stopped by uninvited, pretending to welcome him while inspecting every inch of the property with thinly veiled disdain. "We keep things tidy around here," he had said, his breath thick with the smell of whiskey even in daylight. Ryan had smiled politely and explained that his property was technically outside the HOA boundary, grandfathered in before the association expanded. Garrett's smile had tightened. "Everything around here falls under my watch," he'd replied. It sounded like a joke, but the glint in his eyes said otherwise. Over the next few weeks, Ryan barely thought of him. The renovation consumed his focus. The sound of drills and hammers mixed with the scent of fresh lumber, and Michael's crew worked steadily, respectful of the property lines and local ordinances. Then came the first warning, a note folded and left under Ryan's windshield wiper one evening. "Unauthorized construction. Contact HOA immediately." No signature, just the stamped seal of the association. Ryan dismissed it, thinking it was a clerical error. The next day, however, Garrett himself appeared at the edge of the driveway, watching as the workers poured cement forms. He didn't speak, just stood there with arms crossed, his face red from the afternoon heat, and something else. Resentment, maybe. Michael greeted him casually, unaware of the tension. "Hey there, sir. We're just setting the base for the retaining wall." Garrett didn't answer. He muttered something about violations and walked away. By the third day, his truck began parking across the street every morning. He would sit there for an hour, staring. Ryan tried to ignore him, but the men on site were growing uncomfortable. Michael joked about it at first, calling him the neighborhood warden, but unease crept into his tone. It all came to a head one Saturday morning when Garrett stormed up the driveway, unsteady on his feet, shouting that the noise had to stop. His voice was slurred, his eyes glassy. The smell of alcohol hit before his words did. "You can't dig here," he yelled, waving a crumpled paper he claimed was a stop work order. Michael stepped forward, calm but firm, explaining that the permits were county-issued, not under HOA authority. Garrett's face flushed darker, veins rising on his temple. He reached into his jacket, his hand trembling slightly, and when it came out, he was holding a pistol. For a heartbeat, the world froze. The men stopped moving, the air thickened with disbelief, and even the distant buzz of cicadas seemed to vanish. Ryan wasn't home yet. He was picking up materials. But Michael's body camera, standard for his company's insurance, was recording every second. Garrett's finger hovered near the trigger as he shouted incoherently about trespassing and defending community property. One of the workers slowly raised his hands and tried to calm him down. Garrett staggered backward, the gun wavering, until he tripped slightly on the curb, regained his footing, and pointed it again. The fear in that moment was raw and suffocating, but beneath it, the camera caught something else. A glazed expression, a twitch in his jaw, and the undeniable slur of a drunk man who no longer knew where authority ended and rage began. When Ryan arrived minutes later, the scene was chaos. Police lights flickered against the half-built wall, officers separating the workers while Garrett argued that he had been threatened. Ryan saw the pistol still in the officer's hand, tagged as evidence, and the smell of alcohol heavy in the air. The officers' hesitation was palpable. They knew Garrett. One of them had served with him years ago. But the video, that single, unblinking witness, changed everything. Ryan didn't realize it then, but that footage would ignite a battle that would tear through the facade of order this neighborhood had been built upon, and expose how easily power becomes poison when no one dares to confront it. The following morning began in a haze of disbelief that clung to Ryan like dust. The incident with Garrett should have ended the previous day, sealed away in police reports and evidence bags, but the neighborhood had already begun to hum with gossip. From his kitchen window, Ryan could see curtains shifting in the nearby houses, silhouettes pausing in doorways, as if the whole community had collectively turned into silent jurors. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the image of the contractor frozen in place while Garrett's trembling hand aimed a loaded gun at him. The police had taken statements, collected the footage from Michael's Bodycam, and assured Ryan that everything would be handled by the book. Yet even that phrase sounded weak, hollow, as if it was meant to pacify rather than promise justice. He remembered how one of the officers, a man with the same kind of authoritative stance Garrett had exchanged a knowing look with him before saying quietly, "You know he's one of ours, right? Retired but still got friends on the force." It wasn't a threat exactly, just a fact heavy with implication. Ryan had nodded, realizing that this wasn't going to be a clean resolution. Later that day, Michael stopped by to collect his tools. He moved slower than usual, glancing toward the street every few seconds, as though expecting Garrett's truck to reappear. "I've worked construction 20 years, he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Never had a man point a gun at me for digging dirt. His laugh was thin, without humor. "You think they'll actually press charges?" Ryan hesitated. "They have to," he said, though the conviction in his voice felt brittle. "The body cam caught everything." Michael nodded, but his eyes said he didn't believe it. Before he left, he handed Ryan a small flash drive. "Backup copy, in case things go missing." Ryan turned it over in his palm, feeling its weight like a lifeline. By evening, his inbox began to fill with HOA emails. Official-sounding notices, stamped with the association's logo, accused him of unapproved construction and creating hazardous conditions for neighboring properties. The language was formal, the tone patronizing. He recognized Garrett's style in every sentence. The most chilling message came directly from Garrett's official HOA address, written as though nothing had happened. "Until this matter is reviewed, all work on your property must cease immediately. Further defiance will result in legal consequences." There was no mention of the firearm, no acknowledgement of the police involvement, just bureaucratic arrogance masquerading as authority. Ryan replied once, attaching copies of his county permits, but the emails continued, each more aggressive than the last. By the end of the week, HOA board members were calling him directly, some apologetic, others clearly uncomfortable. "We can't intervene," one whispered over the phone. "Garrett's still president until there's an official hearing, and well, people are scared of him." The next day, Ryan found a new letter taped to his garage door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky, and unsigned. "You should have left it alone. He runs this neighborhood. Don't make things worse." It was the kind of threat that carried the stench of cowardice, meant to intimidate without taking ownership. Ryan stared at it for a long time before tearing it down. Fear was creeping into his routine in subtle ways. The way he checked the locks twice before bed, how he paused before stepping outside when headlights slowed near his driveway, the instinctive flinch every time his phone buzzed. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but this was different. It wasn't a single act of violence anymore. It was the start of a siege built on silence, loyalty, and fear. When the police finally contacted him for a follow-up, their tone had changed. The officer on the line, someone new, sounded weary but cautious. Mr. Hall, we've reviewed the footage. There's clear evidence of reckless endangerment, but there's complication. Mr. Morgan has legal representation and claims he was responding to a perceived threat. Ryan could almost hear the shrug over the phone. The district attorney's still reviewing. He pressed the question that had been gnawing at him since the incident. Was he tested for alcohol? The pause on the other end was long enough to confirm his suspicion. That part's inconclusive, the officer said finally, his voice dropping lower. But the footage you submitted, it shows him slurring, unsteady. It's strong evidence. Keep your copy safe. 2 days later, the footage leaked online. Not from Ryan, not from Michael, but from an anonymous account that posted it to a local forum under the title, HOA President Loses It at Construction Site. Within hours, it spread. The video was grainy but unmistakable. Garrett stumbling, shouting incoherent threats, waving a firearm, the distinct metallic click of the trigger being pulled with no discharge. The comments section filled with outrage. People shared stories of their own encounters with him. Threats, fines, intimidation. The local news picked it up by the next morning. A journalist called Ryan for comment, but he refused. He didn't want to be part of a spectacle. He just wanted his house finished and his life back. But Garrett didn't see it that way. By that weekend, Garrett's truck was back on the street, parked directly across from Ryan's property. The man himself sat behind the wheel, arms crossed, glaring at anyone who walked by. He looked different, more haggard, but his arrogance was intact. At one point he got out, pacing near the curb, talking loudly to a neighbor, proclaiming that he was being framed by outsiders. His voice carried across the lawns. They think they can ruin me over a misunderstanding? That man's lucky I didn't shoot for real. The words struck like stones. Ryan called the police again, reporting harassment, but the dispatcher's tone was weary, almost apologetic. We'll send someone when available, sir. No one came. That night, Ryan reviewed the footage again. He watched Garrett's eyes, bloodshot, wild, lost, and realized something deeper was rotting beneath the surface. This wasn't about property lines or noise complaints. Garrett had built his identity around control, and now that power was slipping away. Losing it made him dangerous. When the county finally issued a restraining order 3 days later, Ryan felt relief for the first time in weeks, but it was fleeting. Early the next morning, someone slashed the contractor's tires, and a dead bird was left on Ryan's porch with a note pinned to its feathers. Keep filming. He stood there for a long time, holding that fragile, horrible message, knowing exactly who had sent it. The catalyst had been struck, and there was no undoing it. The line between authority and insanity had blurred, and Garrett Morgan was unraveling in public view. The Bodycam footage had exposed him. The law had turned against him, and yet he still roamed the neighborhood like a ghost clinging to power. For Ryan, the realization came quietly but firmly. This wasn't a simple dispute anymore. It was the beginning of a war for truth, reputation, and safety, fought in the most deceptively peaceful suburb in the county. He locked the door, closed the blinds, and knew with chilling certainty that Garrett wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The neighborhood changed after that week. Not in sudden or visible ways, but in subtle fractures that Ryan could feel beneath the surface of every polite wave and forced smile. People who used to stop and chat now crossed the street when they saw him coming. Conversations fell silent when he stepped outside. The video had made Garrett a local pariah, but it had also made Ryan the symbol of rebellion against the HOA, and for many residents that was an uncomfortable position to be associated with. Garrett himself hadn't been arrested yet. The county prosecutor was still reviewing evidence, a phrase that seemed to stretch endlessly. But he had been stripped of his firearm license, at least temporarily, and his reputation was collapsing. The morning the news reported that his permit had been revoked, Ryan found his mailbox ripped out of the ground. Someone had poured cement into the empty slot where it once stood, sealing it like a warning. The hostility didn't stop there. Anonymous letters started arriving, one stuffed with printouts of online comments mocking Garrett, another smeared with motor oil and the words, "Hope you're proud," scrawled across the paper. His contractor, Michael, refused to return to work until things cooled down, which meant the half-finished porch and dug-up yard sat exposed like a wound. Every night, headlights lingered too long outside his house. Sometimes the lights turned off completely, and the car stayed, just an engine idling somewhere in the dark. Ryan would stand behind the curtains, phone in hand, debating whether to call the police again. But he knew what they would say. Without proof, it would be dismissed as paranoia. Yet the fear was real, constant and tangible in the silence that wrapped around his home after dusk. Garrett, despite the public humiliation, seemed determined to rewrite the narrative. The HOA's monthly bulletin was released 2 weeks after the video leak, and it contained a letter signed by him as acting president. In it, he accused certain individuals of spreading false media narratives and deliberately endangering the safety of community members during unauthorized construction. He didn't mention Ryan by name, but the implication was clear to everyone. The letter ended with a chilling statement. The HOA reserves the right to take action to preserve peace and property values by any means necessary. It was bureaucracy dressed in threat, the kind of language that could be defended as harmless but felt like a clenched fist behind polite words. Ryan considered ignoring it, but his attorney urged otherwise. The lawyer, a calm, sharp woman named Dana Weiss, had seen similar tactics before. "This isn't about the letter," she explained, flipping through the HOA's bylaws at her desk. "It's about intimidation. He's trying to make you look unstable so that if this goes to court, you're the aggressor." Her tone was professional, but Ryan could sense her unease. "The problem," she added, "is that he still has influence. The other board members owe him favors." Dana advised him to document everything: calls, texts, even photographs of his property every morning in case of vandalism. Men like Garrett don't stop at words. They escalate until someone stops them. That prophecy fulfilled itself faster than Ryan expected. One night, around 1 a.m., he was awakened by the sound of glass shattering. He ran downstairs to find a brick lying in the kitchen amid a spray of shards. Taped to it was a torn piece of the HOA bulletin with Garrett's signature visible under the glare of the kitchen light. The police came, took photos, and filed a report, but their attitude was the same quiet resignation Ryan had grown used to. "No witnesses, no fingerprints," the officer said, his tone almost apologetic. "We'll make a note of it." He left with a shrug that told Ryan everything he needed to know. No one wanted to be the one who crossed Garrett Morgan. The next morning, Ryan walked out to his driveway to find Garrett's truck idling across the street again. The window rolled down just enough for a smirk to appear. "You're turning this place into a circus," Garrett called out, his voice still hoarse but steady, the bravado creeping back. "You think anyone wants a neighbor like you? You're the reason property values are dropping." Ryan didn't respond. He turned, forcing himself to walk away, but the man's laughter followed him down the path. Later that day, he received an official notice from the HOA claiming that his unfinished construction posed a safety hazard and that further neglect would incur daily fines. Garrett had signed it personally, though technically he no longer had the right to. The arrogance was deliberate, a test to see how far he could push before Ryan would break. When Ryan showed the notice to Dana, she exhaled sharply through her nose. "He's baiting you. Don't take it. Everything he does now is to make you react." But it was impossible to stay calm forever. The harassment had started seeping into Ryan's work life. His clients had seen the video, read the headlines, and now avoided his calls, unsure whether associating with him might invite controversy. He spent long nights alone in the unfinished living room, surrounded by exposed beams and the faint smell of dust and concrete, wondering how one man's madness could ripple through an entire community like poison in water. The next escalation came from within the HOA itself. A week after the brick incident, Ryan was invited, rather summoned, to attend a community discussion about the events. The email was signed by Vice President Marlene Gray, a woman known for her politeness and her inability to stand up to Garrett. Against Dana's advice, Ryan decided to attend. He needed to see how deep this rot went. The meeting was held in the local clubhouse, A sterile room with beige carpeting and the faint smell of coffee. About 20 residents sat in folding chairs, avoiding his gaze. Garrett wasn't there, at least not at first. Marlene began with a nervous smile, talking about the importance of restoring harmony. When she mentioned the unfortunate incident, a few people muttered, and Ryan realized many of them hadn't even watched the full footage, just fragments twisted by gossip. Halfway through the meeting, the door opened, and Garrett walked in like a returning king. The room stiffened. His hair was unkempt, his face puffy, but his confidence was undiminished. "I think I should be able to defend myself," he said, cutting off Marlene mid-sentence. He turned toward Ryan, his eyes glassy with contempt. "You brought outsiders into our community. You turned neighbors into enemies." Ryan stood, his hands trembling despite himself. "You pointed a gun at my contractor, Garrett. You're lucky nobody died." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Garrett smirked. "There's no proof I was drunk," he said, "and the gun wasn't loaded." The crowd shifted uneasily, but he kept talking. "You people need to decide who you trust, a man who's lived here 20 years, or someone who shows up and starts trouble." Ryan could have argued, could have shouted, but instead he reached into his jacket and placed a printed still frame from the Bodycam video on the table, Garrett with the gun raised, face twisted with fury, eyes half-lidded. "This," he said quietly, "is what you're defending." Then he walked out. That night, someone painted the word liar in red across his garage door. The message was sloppy but deliberate, the paint dripping like blood in the pale porch light. Ryan stood there for a long time, the smell of chemicals burning his nose, feeling the shift inside him. The realization that this was no longer just a feud. It was a campaign. Garrett was losing control of his world, and he would drag Ryan down with him before surrendering it. The first escalation had begun in silence and would only end with confrontation, one that neither law nor reason could prevent anymore. The breaking point came quietly, not with sirens or shouting, but with an envelope slipped under Ryan's door on a Sunday morning. The sun was barely up, the air thick with the smell of damp soil after last night's rain. He had been up since dawn, trying to distract himself with meaningless tasks, tightening screws on the porch railing, sweeping the unfinished floors. Anything to avoid thinking about how completely his life had been consumed by Garrett Morgan. When he saw the envelope, plain white, no return address, something inside him braced instinctively for another blow. He tore it open at the kitchen counter, and his heart sank before he even finished reading. The letter was from a law firm representing the HOA, demanding immediate cessation of all defamatory activity against its president and threatening a civil suit for damages exceeding $250,000. The words were polished, legally careful, but the intent was obvious. Garrett was fighting back, and he was using the system as his weapon. Ryan's attorney Dana was already expecting something like this. "He's flipping the narrative," she said over the phone later that morning, her tone clipped and measured. "He's going to argue that your video leak caused him reputational harm. It doesn't matter that he was the aggressor. He'll use litigation to drain you until you stop fighting." Her advice was simple but bleak. Document everything, don't respond directly, and prepare for a drawn-out legal war. Ryan felt the weight of her words settle in his chest like a stone. Every day since the incident had become a small battle in a larger war he hadn't asked for. The unfinished house stood as a monument to everything he had lost. His peace, his focus, his sense of belonging. Even the workers refused to return. Their company had received a community complaint, citing safety concerns. And though no one admitted it, Ryan knew Garrett had been behind it. The contractor, Michael, loyal but wary, called him in secret one evening. "Man, I hate to say it, but people are scared. The guy's still got friends in the sheriff's office. He's telling everyone you set him up to make a quick buck with that video." Ryan almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but the sound came out hollow. "Michael, he pointed a loaded gun at you," he said. "You saw it." There was a pause on the other end before Michael answered quietly, "Yeah, I saw it. But I've also got a family, and the HOA's already been calling about my license. I'm sorry, man." The line went dead. The isolation grew thicker. Neighbors crossed the street when Ryan came outside, pretending to check their mailboxes or pull weeds until he was gone. Someone left a stack of flyers on his driveway titled, "Protect Our Neighborhood Integrity," filled with distorted quotes from anonymous sources claiming Ryan had harassed HOA staff and edited the video to frame Garrett. The smear campaign was working. When he went to the grocery store, he caught people staring at him, whispering, their expressions flickering with curiosity and unease. The community had turned, not because they believed Garrett, but because fear was easier than involvement. That was how Garrett had ruled for years, through exhaustion and intimidation, until people learned to look the other way. One night, unable to sleep, Ryan opened his laptop and began searching through the HOA's public financial records. Dana had mentioned that most associations were legally required to post budget reports and meeting minutes. Hours turned into dawn as he scrolled through dense spreadsheets and vague expense logs. Then, buried in a report from the previous year, he saw something that made his pulse quicken. Multiple security expenditures, billed to a private company named Garrison Response Solutions. The payments were large, tens of thousands of dollars over several months, classified under community enforcement. The name was familiar, and when he searched it, his stomach turned. The company specialized in risk mitigation for residential developments, mostly ex-police contractors who offered surveillance and protective intervention. Garrett had been funneling HOA funds into hiring private muscle to enforce his rules. It wasn't illegal on paper, but it explained the pattern of fear that hung over the neighborhood. He called Dana the next morning, his voice shaking with equal parts adrenaline and disbelief. "He's been paying a private security group with HOA money," Ryan said. "He's using them to intimidate people." She was silent for a moment before responding. "Get me those documents. If that's true, it changes everything. That's financial misconduct." But before they could act, Garrett made his next move. That afternoon, Ryan returned home to find a black SUV parked halfway down his street, tinted windows reflecting the sky like dark glass. A man in a polo shirt leaned against the hood, arms crossed, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. When Ryan approached, the man straightened, his expression neutral but unmistakably threatening. "You're Ryan Hall," he said flatly. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA. You're being served." He handed over a thick envelope, Garrett's official defamation lawsuit, and turned back to the SUV without another word. Ryan stood in the driveway, envelope in hand, watching as the vehicle disappeared around the corner, its silence more menacing than noise could ever be. That night, Dana came over to help him go through the paperwork. The defamation claim was absurdly detailed, filled with contradictions and outright fabrications. Garrett alleged emotional distress, career damage, and physical trauma from being falsely portrayed as violent. He had even attached doctored transcripts of text messages, supposedly from Ryan, threatening to ruin him. Dana's brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages. "He's manufacturing evidence," she said. "This isn't just harassment anymore. It's criminal." Ryan stared at the document spread across his dining table, feeling as though his own life had been rewritten by someone else's lies. "He's going to destroy me," he whispered, not out of fear, but with the hollow certainty of someone who understood how power worked in the real world. Dana looked at him, her expression softening. "Then we destroy him first. We've got the truth. We've got the footage, and now we've got motive." The next few days were a blur of strategy meetings, paperwork, and sleepless nights. Ryan filed a countersuit for harassment and emotional distress, attaching the video, police reports, and HOA correspondence as evidence. Dana worked through contacts in the press, leaking documents that exposed Garrett's misuse of HOA funds. The local news stations picked up the story again, this time with a sharper focus. HOA president under investigation for misuse of community money. Garrett responded predictably, with fury. He held a press conference outside his home, flanked by a handful of loyal neighbors, ranting about smear tactics and outsiders poisoning our town. His speech spiraled into a rant about personal freedom and government overreach, his voice rising, his words slurring just enough for the cameras to catch. When the footage aired that evening, it was damning. Social media tore him apart. Sponsors of the HOA withdrew support. The county board called an emergency review of his leadership. But Garrett wasn't finished. 2 nights later, Ryan woke to the sound of his motion alarms blaring. He ran to the window and froze. His car was on fire. Flames roared from the engine, lighting the entire front yard in a hellish orange glow. He called 911, his voice shaking as he tried to explain, but the dispatcher's tone was almost routine, as if this were just another call in a long night. The fire department arrived too late to save the vehicle. The next morning, investigators found traces of accelerant on the pavement. There were no witnesses, no cameras that caught the act, but Ryan didn't need proof to know who had done it. Garrett had crossed another line, and with it, whatever facade of civility still remained between them was gone. The next day, Dana filed an emergency restraining order against Garrett and the HOA's security contractors. The county granted it within hours. For the first time, the balance of power began to shift. The sheriff's department seized Garrett's remaining firearms, citing a violation of his suspended license, and an official audit of the HOA's finances was launched. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began speaking up. Stories of fines, threats, and random inspections that now sounded less like community management and more like coercion. Ryan felt something he hadn't in weeks, a cautious, flickering sense of vindication. The truth was finally surfacing. But beneath that fragile relief was another emotion, darker and heavier. Garrett had been humiliated, stripped of authority and cornered, and men like him didn't fade quietly. They lashed out. Ryan knew this wasn't the end. It was the midpoint of something far uglier, the eye of a storm that had only paused to catch its breath. The fire had been a message. The war was now personal, and neither the law nor logic would stop Garrett Morgan from trying to reclaim the one thing he had lost completely: control. The temporary sense of safety that followed the restraining order lasted less than a week. Ryan had started to believe, if only faintly, that the legal wall surrounding Garrett might finally hold him back. The HOA board had been suspended pending investigation. The police had confiscated his remaining weapons, and the neighborhood had fallen into an uneasy silence. But beneath that silence there was something electric, like the still air before a thunderstorm. It began with the phone calls, unknown numbers at strange hours, a few seconds of static before the line went dead. Then came the anonymous complaints to the county office. Noise violations, false reports of unpermitted construction, even a fabricated claim that Ryan had assaulted a delivery worker. Each one required formal response and wasted hours of his time, but the pattern was obvious. Garrett was still pulling strings through others, using whatever influence he still had left. Dana warned him that such tactics were designed to exhaust rather than incriminate. "He's testing how much pressure you can take," she said. "He knows he can't touch you legally, so he'll keep making your life unbearable until you break first." Ryan tried to focus on rebuilding, but the damage wasn't only structural. The fire had scorched more than his driveway. It had burned away any illusion that reason or law would stop a man like Garrett. Neighbors avoided eye contact entirely now. Even those who once sympathized with Ryan pretended not to see him. It was as if the entire street had silently agreed that his presence brought danger. The insurance company hesitated to pay out on his car, citing pending investigation. Garrett's lawyer had filed an appeal against the restraining order, claiming misinterpretation of threat. And through it all, Garrett himself disappeared from public view, retreating into whatever hole he was nursing his bitterness in. The absence was worse than confrontation. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Late one evening, while reviewing documents for the ongoing countersuit, he noticed movement on one of his security feeds. The side gate camera flickered, then went dark. He froze, staring at the screen until the recording resumed 30 seconds later, showing nothing but an empty yard. He went outside with a flashlight, his pulse hammering against his ribs, and found fresh boot prints in the mud just beyond the fence line. Whoever had been there knew exactly where the blind spot was. He sent the footage to Dana the next morning, who immediately contacted the police. They sent an officer who walked around, took a few photos, and left without saying much. "We'll log it," he said, but his tone made it sound like a chore. Ryan could tell he didn't believe anything would come of it. 3 nights later, Garrett returned. It wasn't a confrontation, at least not the kind that could be proven. Ryan saw him from the upstairs window, standing across the street in the rain, half hidden under the hood of a dark jacket. He didn't move, didn't shout, just stood there for nearly 10 minutes before disappearing into the shadows. When Ryan reported it, the dispatcher's voice carried that same thin note of indifference. Unless he violates the restraining order by approaching your property, there's nothing we can do. Ryan almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Garrett could stalk him from the curb for hours, and as long as he didn't cross an invisible line, it was considered legal. Dana advised installing more cameras and warned him not to confront Garrett directly. "He wants you to lose your temper," she said. "The moment you retaliate, he wins." But Garrett didn't need confrontation to cause damage. The next escalation came through the courts. His appeal had somehow gained traction with a sympathetic judge, one of his former drinking buddies from the precinct. The restraining order was reduced in scope, now limited to direct contact, which meant Garrett could legally attend public HOA meetings again. Within days, he organized one in the community hall, announcing it through flyers slipped into every mailbox except Ryan's. Dana suggested they attend regardless. "If we're not there, he controls the narrative," she said. Ryan reluctantly agreed. The night of the meeting, the hall was packed. The tension was almost physical, a mix of fear, curiosity, and morbid fascination. Garrett entered last, flanked by 2 men Ryan didn't recognize, private security from the same company Ryan had exposed weeks earlier. The audacity made Ryan's stomach twist. Garrett looked thinner, paler, but the arrogance was intact. His smile a practiced mask stretched over rage. He walked straight to the front, clapped his hands once, and began to speak as though the last month hadn't happened. "We've had some misunderstandings in this community," he began, his tone polished and paternal. "Mistakes were made, tempers flared, but we must restore order." He didn't mention the gun, the fire, or the investigation. Instead, he painted himself as the victim of slander, claiming outsiders were trying to dismantle neighborhood integrity. Ryan waited until Garrett's speech reached its sanctimonious peak before standing. "Order?" he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "You pulled a gun on my contractor, you burned my car, you've terrorized half this neighborhood, and you call it order?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Garrett's expression hardened for just a moment before he recovered. "There's no proof of any of that," he said smoothly. "And it's convenient that the only witness in your story works for you." Ryan pulled a folder from his bag, holding up printed stills from the security footage showing the man outside his fence, the SUV from the fire, and the receipts connecting Garrett to Garrison Response Solutions. "How about proof like this?" Garrett's facade cracked, the smile faltering. His 2 guards shifted uneasily, and Marlene, the vice president, rose to calm the crowd. "We're not here for personal attacks," she said nervously, but her voice was drowned out by the murmurs of residents beginning to question what they had just seen. The meeting collapsed into chaos. Garrett shouted for order, his voice rising above the noise, and when that failed, he slammed his fist on the podium hard enough to echo through the room. His composure was gone, replaced by raw fury. "You think you can destroy me with lies?" he bellowed. "You're nothing here, Hall. You're an outsider, a parasite living off what better men built." His face was red, sweat glistening under the fluorescent lights. For the first time, the crowd saw him without the mask. Dana leaned toward Ryan and whispered, "Let him talk. He's burying himself." By the time it ended, Garrett had stormed out, leaving behind a room full of stunned residents. The next morning, clips from the meeting appeared online. Someone had filmed his outburst, and the video spread even faster than the original Bodycam footage. This time, there was no ambiguity, no way to twist his words into defense. Sponsors withdrew entirely, and the County Ethics Board officially suspended him from any HOA role pending criminal proceedings. But the victory felt hollow. Ryan returned home to find his fence slashed open, his front door smeared with motor oil, and the words, "You'll pay for this," scrawled across the siding in thick black paint. The escalation had reached a fever pitch. Garrett was unraveling publicly, his influence collapsing, but that only made him more dangerous. Dana begged Ryan to leave town temporarily until the investigation concluded, but he refused. "If I leave," he said quietly, "he wins. He turns me into the coward he wants everyone to believe I am." He stood in the wreckage of his porch, breathing in the acrid smell of oil and fear, realizing that the line between survival and surrender had narrowed to a razor's edge. Garrett had lost his power over the community, but he still had nothing left to lose, and men with nothing left were the most unpredictable of all. The courtroom was smaller than Ryan expected, its air thick with the scent of old wood and disinfectant, but the tension inside it was almost tangible. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras resting like dormant predators waiting for motion, while neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now sat in uneasy silence, drawn by the spectacle of Garrett Morgan finally facing the consequences of everything he had done. The judge entered without ceremony, a tired man whose face betrayed years of dealing with petty disputes. But there was a flicker of interest in his eyes when he glanced at the stack of evidence waiting on the bench. This was not an ordinary HOA matter. This was a trial that had become a symbol of power turned poisonous, of suburban order unraveling into menace. Ryan sat beside Dana, his jaw tight, his heart steady. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing every question, every response, every breath. The video of Garrett's breakdown at the HOA meeting had already done most of the work. His violent gestures, his drunken rant, his threats caught clearly on multiple phones. But Ryan knew that people like Garrett didn't crumble quietly. When Garrett entered, the room shifted. He looked thinner than before, his once confident posture slumped, but still defiant, his suit ill-fitted, the color drained from his face. He gave Ryan a look that was neither anger nor shame, but something darker, almost feral, the kind of expression a man wears when he realizes the world no longer belongs to him. His attorney, a smug corporate litigator hired through an HOA fund that was now frozen pending investigation, whispered something to him as they sat. Garrett nodded absently, his eyes never leaving Ryan. When the proceedings began, the defense tried to paint Garrett as a victim of media hysteria and digital manipulation. They called him a man driven to desperation by harassment, a respected veteran of law enforcement who had been pushed beyond reason by Ryan's supposed provocations. But the strategy crumbled almost immediately when the prosecution played the full Bodycam footage. The room went utterly silent as Garrett's drunken voice filled the speakers, his slurred threats echoing against the paneled walls, the metallic click of the trigger cutting through the stillness like a gunshot. When the video ended, Garrett's attorney shifted uncomfortably, but his client only smirked, muttering under his breath, "It wasn't loaded." Dana stood then, her voice calm but cold as glass. She laid out the evidence in a steady rhythm that left no room for doubt, the financial records of misused HOA funds, the contracts with the private security firm, the threatening letters and photos of vandalism, and finally, the forensic report, showing gasoline residue matching the brand Garrett had purchased 2 days before Ryan's car was set on fire. Every detail landed like a blow, precise and methodical. When she called Ryan to the stand, he spoke not with outrage, but with quiet exhaustion, describing how each escalation had eroded the sense of safety he once associated with home. He spoke of sleepless nights, of fear disguised as composure, of watching the community dissolve into silence because one man believed authority meant ownership. His words didn't dramatize, they humanized, and that was more powerful than any accusation. Garrett's turn on the stand was chaos barely contained. His attorney tried to guide him through rehearsed answers, but his temper was a wild thing, snapping at every cornered question. When confronted with the vandalism photos, he accused Ryan of planting evidence. When shown the purchase receipts, he claimed coincidence. The courtroom watched as his composure unraveled, his voice rising until the judge had to call for order. And then, in a moment that would later be replayed endlessly on local news, Garrett leaned forward, his face twisted with fury, and shouted, "He deserved it! People like him come into our neighborhoods and think they can do whatever they want. I kept this place safe before he ever showed up." The words hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and undeniable. The judge's gavel struck sharply, calling for silence, but the damage was done. Whatever sympathy might have lingered for Garrett evaporated instantly. The verdict came faster than anyone expected. The court found Garrett Morgan guilty of reckless endangerment, harassment, and destruction of property, with civil damages awarded to Ryan totaling $120,000. His firearm rights were permanently revoked, and a restraining order was reinstated with no expiration date. The HOA's charter was suspended pending reorganization, its accounts seized for audit, its members stripped of voting privileges until further notice. When the judge read the sentence, Garrett didn't move. He sat motionless, his face a pale mask of disbelief, before finally muttering something inaudible and lowering his head into his hands. The bailiff placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him out of the courtroom, but he resisted for a moment, turning his head to glare at Ryan one last time. It wasn't rage anymore. It was a hollow look of a man who had built his life on control and was now facing the void that came after losing it. Outside, the sky was gray, the air heavy with the kind of quiet that follows a long storm. Reporters crowded near the courthouse steps, but Ryan didn't stop to speak. Dana handled the questions, her tone measured and professional, repeating that justice had been served. Ryan stood a few feet away, watching the courthouse doors close behind Garrett, and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months, relief mixed with grief. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, only the hollow release of tension that had bound every waking moment since the day Garrett pulled a gun on his contractor. The victory was real, but it came at a cost measured not in money, but in trust, in sleep, in the quiet certainty that home was supposed to mean safety. As he walked toward his car, the reporters' voices fading into the background, Ryan realized that Garrett's downfall wasn't just his own story. It was the story of an entire community forced to confront what happens when authority becomes addiction. And when fear is mistaken for leadership. The trial had ended, but the echo of Garrett's words would linger, a reminder that peace, once broken, is never truly restored. It must be rebuilt, piece by fragile piece. The weeks that followed the trial felt unreal, as if the neighborhood itself had exhaled after holding its breath for months. For the first time in nearly a year, the street was quiet, not the tense, watchful silence that had become normal, but a peaceful kind, punctuated by the sounds of sprinklers and children's laughter returning cautiously to the yards. The black SUV that once loomed at the corner was gone, the smell of burned rubber and gasoline replaced by the scent of fresh paint and cut grass. Ryan's home, once scarred by vandalism, began to look like a home again. He hired a new contractor to finish the porch, someone from outside the community who had only heard fragments of what happened. The man worked quickly, saying little, and Ryan found comfort in that simplicity. He could finally walk outside without scanning the street first, though sometimes his mind still replayed Garrett's voice echoing through the courtroom, that furious insistence on control that now seemed pitiful rather than terrifying. The HOA was officially dissolved by court order 2 months later, its finances absorbed by the county for redistribution and oversight. A new residents' committee formed, smaller and less formal, one that operated through open meetings rather than threats and fines. Some of the same neighbors who had once avoided Ryan now stopped by with quiet apologies, awkward but sincere. "We were scared," one woman admitted, standing on his newly rebuilt porch, her eyes full of guilt. Ryan nodded, accepting it without resentment. Fear had ruled them all, and it had taken something violent to shatter it. The first meeting of the Reformed Neighborhood Group was held in Ryan's yard at his suggestion. A symbolic gesture, though he didn't call it that. People brought folding chairs, snacks, and cautious smiles. There were no speeches, no formalities, only the quiet relief of people reclaiming something that had been taken from them. When night fell and the last of the neighbors went home, Ryan stayed outside, sitting on the steps of his finished porch. The air was cool, the cicadas loud in the trees, and for the first time in a long time he felt still. The fear that had once lived in the pit of his stomach was gone, replaced by something steadier, a kind of quiet strength that came not from winning, but from surviving without surrendering to bitterness. Garrett Morgan was serving his sentence, his name fading from headlines, his shadow no longer stretching over their lives. The damage he left behind couldn't be erased entirely, but it had forced the community to confront the truth about what kind of place they wanted to live in. Ryan looked around at the street, at the dim lights in the windows of houses that had once seemed like fortresses, and he thought of how fragile peace really was, how easily it could be fractured by a single man's need to control what he never owned. He didn't feel anger anymore, only clarity, the understanding that justice wasn't about punishment alone, but about restoring balance. When he finally stood to go inside, the porch light flickered on automatically, washing the yard in soft gold. It was late, and tomorrow there would be ordinary things to do again. Work to catch up on, plants to water, plans to rebuild. Life, after everything, was continuing, quiet and unremarkable in the best possible way. And for the first time, that felt like victory.